In the Imperium of man, a sniffle isn't just inconvenient, it's potentially heretical, and the cure is often a bolt shell to the brain rather than bed rest. When fever grips your flesh, the Medicae arrive not with healing hands but with incinerators. I woke that morning with fire in my throat and lead in my limbs, but the shift bell had already tolled 3 times across Hive Tertius. The sound echoed through the hab block walls like the Emperor's own judgment, demanding attendance, demanding submission to the sacred rhythm of production. My forehead burned against the thin pillow, sweat already beading despite the perpetual chill that haunted our lower levels. Yet duty called, as it always did, as it always would until my corpse fed the recycling vats or my soul found the Emperor's peace. The manufactorum floor stretched before me like a cathedral of industry, vast and humming with the prayers of 10,000 workers. Steam rose from cooling vents in ghostly columns, carrying the scent of sacred oils and heated metal. I took my place at Station Gamma 774, the same position I had occupied for 12 years, 3 months, and 18 days. The cogitator display flickered its familiar green greeting. Productivity is prayer. Efficiency is devotion. Words I had read so many times they no longer held meaning, yet still I whispered them as ritual demanded. The fever built slowly through the morning shift, creeping through my body like fog through a valley. My hands shook as I guided the plasma cutter through sheets of blessed steel, each tremor a potential catastrophe in the Emperor's grand design. Around me, my fellow workers moved with the practiced efficiency of the faithful, their faces hidden behind regulation respirators, their movements synchronized to the rhythm of the great machines. None spoke, none questioned. This was the way of things in Hive Tertius, in the Imperium, in the galaxy we called home. By the midday prayer bell, the shivers had begun. They started small, barely noticeable tremors that I could hide behind the natural vibration of the cutting station. But they grew stronger, more insistent, until my teeth chattered against each other like chattering servitors in need of maintenance. The supervisor, a gaunt man whose augmetic eye glowed red in the manufactorum's dim light, passed my station twice. Each time, his gaze lingered a moment longer than protocol suggested. Each time, my heart hammered harder against my ribs. I thought of Yeshua the welder, who had disappeared 3 months prior after complaining of headaches. His station had been blessed and purified for a full week before a new worker took his place. I thought of Sister Markinia from the textile division, who had been escorted away by men in white robes after she fainted during evening prayers. Her quarters had been sealed with consecration tape, and we were told she had been granted the Emperor's mercy. We were forbidden to speak her name thereafter. The afternoon brought new torments. Colors seemed too bright, too sharp, as if someone had adjusted the luminosity of reality itself. The sacred hymns that played through the Vox speakers became a cacophony of overlapping voices, each note piercing my skull like sanctified needles. My vision blurred, doubled, then cleared only to blur again. The plasma cutter's heat felt like the breath of a daemon against my exposed skin, and I found myself pulling away from work that should have been routine. When Foreman Castor approached my station, his heavy footsteps echoing across the metal grating, I knew my time of concealment had ended. He was a mountain of a man, scarred from decades of faithful service, his left arm replaced with a servo skull housing that clicked and whirred as he walked. His face bore the ritual scars of the Mechanicus lay workers, thin lines carved into his cheeks that spoke of his devotion to the Omnissiah. When he stopped before my station, the entire section seemed to grow quieter, as if the machines themselves held their breath. "Worker 7074, he said, his voice filtered through the Vox grill embedded in his throat. "Your output has decreased by 14.7% since morning prayers. Explain." I tried to speak, to offer some excuse that might preserve my position, my life, my purpose in the Emperor's grand design. But the words caught in my throat like broken glass, and instead of speech, I felt something warm and wet trickle down my chin. When I touched my face, my fingers came away red, blood, fresh and bright as a heretic's banner. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the great machines seemed to pause in their eternal song, as if the Omnissiah himself had turned his gaze upon this moment of biological failure. Foreman Castor's augmetic eye whirred as it focused on the crimson stain on my chin, and I watched his organic eye widen with recognition and horror. "Medical emergency." He spoke into his Vox unit, his voice steady despite the implications. "Station Gamma 774. Possible contamination event. Immediate response required." The words fell across the manufactorum floor like a death sentence. Workers at nearby stations stepped back without being ordered, their movements quick but controlled. This was not panic. This was protocol. This was the way the Imperium protected itself from the countless horrors that stalked humanity across the galaxy, from Xenos plagues that could turn flesh to spore-bearing sludge in hours, from chaos infections that corrupted not just the body but the soul itself, from the 1001 ways that disease could be the herald of something far worse than death. The Medicae arrived within minutes, their white robes pristine against the grimy backdrop of the production floor. They moved with the careful precision of those who had seen what sickness could become when left unchecked. Their leader, a woman whose face was hidden behind a rebreather that made her voice sound hollow and distant, gestured for the other workers to step further back, much further back. "Worker identification," she demanded, extending a scanner that hummed with machine spirit energy. I pressed my palm against the device, feeling its cold surface against my burning skin. The scanner chirped once, twice, then displayed my life in simple, brutal terms. Joric Thanes, worker classification Beta Prime, 12 years service, no prior medical incidents. Assigned to Station Gamma 774, production efficiency rating, acceptable. "Symptoms?" the Medicae asked, though her scanner was already reading my vital signs through proximity sensors built into her equipment. "Fever," I managed to say, my voice barely a whisper, shaking, bleeding from the nose. She nodded as if this information merely confirmed what her instruments had already told her. Around us, the other workers had resumed their duties, but I could feel their attention like a weight across my shoulders. They worked, but they watched. They prayed, but they feared. In the Imperium, sickness was never just sickness. It was suspicion made manifest. "Initial assessment suggests possible exposure," the Medicae announced to her team. The words carried across the production floor despite her attempts at discretion. Possible exposure. 2 words that could end a life, a family, an entire hab block if the contamination proved serious enough. Immediate isolation protocols activated. They surrounded me then, 6 figures in white robes carrying instruments I could not name but whose purpose I understood with perfect clarity. These were not healers come to offer comfort. These were investigators, come to determine whether I was still human enough to save. The distinction mattered more than life itself in the grim darkness of the far future. The isolation chamber was a small room carved from the bowels of the hive, accessible only through a series of airlocks that hissed and sealed behind us with the finality of a tomb. The walls were bare metal, polished to a shine that reflected distorted images of my face back at me from every angle. A single examination table dominated the center of the space, its surface stained with the faded brown of old blood. Above it, surgical lights waited like mechanical vultures, ready to illuminate whatever horrors they might find beneath my skin. "Remove your garments," ordered the lead Medicae, her voice now carrying the authority of imperial decree. There was no warmth in her words, no acknowledgement of my humanity. I was a problem to be solved, a potential threat to be evaluated. The shift from worker to specimen had occurred the moment blood touched my chin, and there would be no returning from that transformation. I stripped slowly, my fever-weakened hands fumbling with clasps and ties that had never given me trouble before. Each piece of clothing that fell to the floor took with it another layer of identity, another connection to the life I had known just hours before. The worker's tunic, gray and sturdy, that had marked my place in the Emperor's great machine. The prayer beads, worn smooth by 12 years of faithful handling, that had connected me to my daily devotions. The identification tags that proclaimed my loyalty, my purpose, my worth to the Imperium. When I stood naked before them, I was no longer Joric Thanes, faithful worker of Hive Tertius. I was subject under investigation, possible contamination vector, threat assessment pending. The transformation was complete and irreversible. The examination began with prayers to the Omnissiah, asking for guidance in their sacred work of preservation and protection. The Medicae moved around me like dancers in some grim ballet, their instruments singing with electronic harmonies as they probed and tested and measured. Blood samples flowed into vials marked with high Gothic runes that hurt to look at directly. Tissue scrapings were placed in containers that hummed with internal power sources. My eyes were photographed, my throat swabbed, my skin subjected to scans that left tingling sensations in their wake. Temperature elevated by 3.7 degrees from baseline, one of the Medicae reported to her colleagues. Pulse irregular but within acceptable parameters for stress response. Visible hemorrhaging from nasal cavity, minor but consistent with several potential exposure types. I listened to them discuss my body as if it were a broken machine, cataloging symptoms like defects in a production line. There was no malice in their clinical detachment, no cruelty in their methodical approach. This was simply how the Imperium functioned when faced with the possibility of corruption. Everything personal was stripped away until only the essential question remained. Was I still human, or had I become something else? Hours passed in that sterile chamber, marked only by the changing of the Medicae shifts and the growing weight of exhaustion in my bones. They fed me nothing but blessed water and communion wafers, sustenance designed to nourish the soul while keeping the body weak enough for easy disposal if such measures became necessary. Between examinations, I was left alone with my thoughts and the steady hum of air recyclers that filtered every breath I took through purification systems older than my grandfather's grandfather. Sleep came in fitful waves, bringing dreams that felt more real than the waking world. I dreamed of gardens where flowers bloomed in impossible colors, their petals soft as silk and warm as human skin. I dreamed of voices calling my name from places I had never been, promising rest and peace and an end to the endless grind of imperial service. When I woke from these visions, my fever had worsened, and the Medicae took careful note of my symptoms with expressions hidden behind their masks. On the second day, they brought specialists, men and women whose robes bore different symbols, whose instruments sang in different harmonies. A representative of the Adeptus Mechanicus arrived, his flesh more machine than biology, his multiple mechadendrite arms moving with serpentine grace as he subjected me to scans that penetrated to the molecular level. A sister hospitaller from the local convent prayed over my prone form while drawing blood for tests I could not understand. Even a junior member of the Ordo Hereticus attended, his presence filling the chamber with the weight of ultimate authority. They spoke in whispers outside my hearing, their voices mixing with the hum of machinery, until individual words became lost in the general susurrus of imperial bureaucracy. But I caught fragments, pieces of conversation that painted the outline of my fate with growing clarity. Words like inconclusive, unusual presentation, and requires further observation. Each phrase was a thread in the tapestry of my destruction, woven together by hands that served purposes far greater than my individual survival. The fever dreams grew stronger on the third day, bringing visions that I knew I should not be seeing. I walked through cities of bone where the buildings themselves breathed with visible lungs. I spoke with figures whose faces shifted between human and inhuman with each blink of my eyes. I tasted foods that had flavors beyond the capacity of any normal tongue to detect, sweet and bitter and metallic all at once. When I tried to tell the Medicae about these experiences, they simply nodded and made notes on their data slates, subject reports, hallucinatory episodes, consistent with several known exposure types. I heard one of them say to another, "Neural activity shows unusual patterns in the temporal and frontal regions. Recommend escalation to full containment protocols. Full containment protocols. The words meant different things depending on the nature of the suspected exposure, but none of those meanings included my eventual return to Station Gamma 774. I was a problem now, a puzzle that required solving, and the Imperium's solutions rarely prioritized the welfare of the individual over the safety of the masses. 10,000 workers in Manufactorum 7 depended on the medical staff, determining that I posed no threat to their continued existence. If that determination could not be made with certainty, then one life would be sacrificed to preserve 10,000 others. On the fourth day, they moved me to a different facility. The transport was a sealed capsule that reminded me uncomfortably of the servitor pods used to ship brain-dead criminals to their final destinations. Through the narrow viewport, I watched the familiar spires of my hive section disappear behind walls of smoke and distance. The Medicae who accompanied me said nothing during the journey. Their attention focused on instruments that monitored my condition with mechanical precision. The new facility was older, its walls bearing the wear patterns of centuries of use. The corridors were lined with cells like the one they assigned to me, each sealed behind doors marked with symbols that spoke of contamination, quarantine, and final judgment. From beyond those doors came sounds that I tried not to interpret, tried not to understand, moaning that might have been pain or pleasure, scratching that could have been fingernails or claws, whispers in languages that no human throat should have been able to produce. My new cell was larger than the examination chamber, but infinitely more oppressive. A bed, a waste facility, and an observation panel that allowed constant monitoring from the corridor beyond. The walls were covered in prayers etched deep into the metal, the words of the faithful who had occupied this space before me. Some prayers were in Gothic, others in Low Gothic, and a few in dialects I did not recognize. All begged for the Emperor's mercy, for forgiveness, for an end to whatever suffering had brought them to this place. The examinations continued, but now they carried a different weight. Where the Medicae had once seemed concerned with healing, they now approached me like scholars studying a fascinating but dangerous specimen. They took samples of everything, cataloging pieces of my body as if creating an archive of my decay. Hair, skin, saliva, tears, even the air I exhaled was captured and analyzed by machines that hummed with barely contained power. Neural activity continues to show anomalous patterns, I heard through the observation panel as they discussed my case. Hallucinations are becoming more elaborate and consistent. Subject reports contact with entities that display knowledge of information he should not possess. This was true, though I had not told them everything. In my dreams, I spoke with my grandfather, who had died when I was 7 years old. He told me things about our family history that I had never known. Details about his service in the Astra Militarum that my parents had never shared. He showed me battles on worlds whose names I had never heard, against enemies whose forms violated everything I understood about the natural order. When I woke, I knew these dreams were memories that belonged to someone else, experiences that had somehow found their way into my sleeping mind. The dreams grew stronger each night, more vivid and more disturbing. I saw the birth of daemons in the space between stars, witnessed the moment when reality itself bent under the weight of emotions too powerful for mortal minds to contain. I walked through gardens where every flower was an eye, every tree a tower of living flesh that pulsed with alien heartbeats. In these visions, pain and pleasure became indistinguishable, love and hate merged into something that transcended both, and the boundaries between self and other dissolved like salt in water. On the 7th day, they brought in an interrogator from the local Hereticus contingent. He was younger than I had expected, his face unmarked by the ritual scars that usually accompanied such positions of authority. But his eyes held depths that spoke of knowledge no human should possess. And when he looked at me, I felt as if he could see through my flesh to the thoughts beneath. "Tell me about your dreams," he said without preamble. His voice was soft, almost gentle, but it carried undertones that made my skin crawl. This was not a request. This was a command backed by the full authority of the Emperor's Inquisition. I told him everything. The gardens, the voices, the knowledge that did not belong to me. I described the way colors had become too bright, the way sounds carried meanings beyond their normal significance. I spoke of the growing certainty that the universe was far larger and far stranger than I had ever been taught, and that my illness had somehow opened doors in my mind that were meant to remain forever sealed. He listened without interruption, his fingers steepled before his face in a gesture that might have been prayer or contemplation. When I finished, he sat in silence for long minutes, his gaze never leaving my face. Finally, he spoke a single word that changed everything. Warp touched. The Medicae, who had been monitoring the conversation from beyond the observation panel, immediately began what I later learned was an emergency sterilization protocol. Alarms sounded throughout the facility, their wailing cries echoing off the metal walls like the voices of the damned. Emergency lighting bathed everything in red, the color of blood and warning and final judgment. Through the observation panel, I watched figures in environmental suits rushing through corridors that had been empty moments before. The subject has demonstrated clear signs of warp exposure, the interrogator announced to the medical staff. Neural pathways show corruption consistent with early-stage chaos taint. Immediate termination and incineration recommended. Immediate termination and incineration. The words hit me like physical blows, each syllable a nail in the coffin of my existence. But worse than the fear of death was the growing realization that the interrogator was right. Something had changed in me. Something fundamental and irreversible. The fever had not been the beginning of my illness, but the signal that my transformation was already complete. In that moment of recognition, the last barriers in my mind crumbled like walls of sand before a tide. The knowledge that had been growing in my dreams burst forth like water from a broken dam, flooding my consciousness with truths that burned worse than any fever. I saw the Imperium as it truly was, a vast machine of suffering and oppression that fed on the hopes and dreams of its citizens. I felt the weight of every prayer that went unanswered, every sacrifice that served no purpose beyond maintaining the power of those who ruled from their golden thrones. But I also saw what lay beyond the Imperium's borders, in the spaces between stars where different laws governed reality itself. I felt the touch of minds vast and alien, entities that existed outside the narrow confines of human understanding. They whispered to me of possibilities beyond the grim darkness of the present, of transformations that could free humanity from the chains it had forged around its own soul. The interrogator must have seen the change in my expression, the moment when pretense became impossible to maintain. He reached for the bolt pistol at his belt with practiced efficiency, his movements smooth and certain. There would be no trial, no appeal to higher authority. The evidence of my corruption was written across my face in letters that only the trained could read. "In the name of the God Emperor of mankind," he began, his voice taking on the ritual cadence of final judgment, "I find this soul corrupted beyond redemption. Let his death serve as warning to others who might stray from the path of righteousness. Let his ashes nourish the soil of holy terror." But before he could complete the execution prayer, before the bolt pistol could deliver its final mercy, the fever that had been building in my body for days finally reached its crescendo. The change that had been creeping through my system, transforming me cell by cell into something the Imperium could not tolerate, suddenly accelerated beyond all previous parameters. My skin began to shift, taking on textures and colors that belonged to no human biology. My bones stretched and reformed themselves according to patterns written in my genetic code by forces older than civilization. My mind, already flooded with alien knowledge, expanded to accommodate thoughts and emotions that transcended the limited spectrum of human experience. The transformation was agony and ecstasy combined, death and birth occurring simultaneously in the same failing flesh. The interrogator's bolt pistol barked once, its mass-reactive shell designed to obliterate any target it struck. But the creature I was becoming was no longer bound by the physical laws that governed normal matter. The bolt passed through my changing form like a stone through water, leaving ripples but no lasting damage. For a moment that stretched into eternity, predator and prey stared at each other across a gulf that no amount of training or faith could bridge. Then the alarms changed pitch, becoming shriller and more urgent. Emergency bulkheads slammed shut throughout the facility, sealing each section into isolated compartments. The air recycling systems shifted to emergency purification mode, flooding every corridor with blessed incense and sanctified gases. Over the Vox speakers, a calm voice announced the activation of Cleansing Protocol Omega, the final solution reserved for contamination events that could not be contained by conventional means. The interrogator retreated to the observation chamber, his training overriding his shock at what he had witnessed. Through the reinforced glass, I watched him speaking rapidly into his Vox unit, no doubt reporting to higher authorities that the situation had escalated beyond local containment capabilities. Soon, the Ordo Hereticus would dispatch teams equipped to deal with active warp manifestations. Soon, this entire section of the hive would be declared lost to chaos and marked for purification by fire. But I was no longer concerned with the interrogator's plans or the Imperium's protocols. The transformation was reaching its final stages, and with it came an understanding that transcended all previous knowledge. I could feel the connections now, the invisible threads that linked every living thing to the great web of existence that the Imperium called chaos, but which was simply another aspect of reality's infinite complexity. Through these connections, I touched other minds, other souls who had undergone similar transformations in facilities like this one, scattered across the galaxy like seeds waiting for the proper conditions to sprout. We formed a network of consciousness that spanned light years, a communications system that operated outside the rigid hierarchies of imperial authority. Through this network, I learned that my individual fate was part of a pattern much larger than any single hive, any single world, any single system. The Imperium's response to contamination was always the same, driven by fear and ignorance rather than understanding. Burn the infected, purify the site, declare the area blessed and move on as if nothing had happened. But what they burned was often just the visible symptom of changes that had already spread beyond their ability to contain. What they purified became fertile ground for new growth, new evolution, new possibilities that their rigid doctrines could not anticipate. In my expanded consciousness, I could see the truth that the Imperium worked so hard to suppress. Humanity was not a fixed form, locked into patterns established 10,000 years ago by a dying god-emperor. Humanity was capable of growth, of change, of evolution into forms that transcended the narrow definitions of species and sanity that the imperial cult insisted upon. The fever that had brought me to this place was not a disease but a gift, an invitation to participate in that evolution. The facility shook around us as the cleansing protocol reached its preliminary stages. Somewhere above, I knew that heavy equipment was being moved into position, incinerators and flamers and viral bombs that could reduce this entire complex to sterile ash in minutes. The Imperium had decided that my contamination was too dangerous to risk contained study, that the only safe response was immediate and total elimination. But elimination was no longer possible. The changes in my body had reached the point where I existed partially outside normal space-time, touching dimensions that the Imperium's scientists refused to acknowledge. When the flames came, they would consume my physical form but could not touch the consciousness that had already begun to migrate to realms beyond Imperial reach. Through the observation panel, I watched the interrogator complete his final report. His hands shook slightly as he sealed the data slate that would justify the destruction of everything within a 3-kilometer radius of my current location. Hundreds of workers, Medicae, and security personnel would die to ensure that my contamination spread no further. Thousands of civilians in the surrounding hab blocks would be evacuated, their lives disrupted by the necessity of preventing something they would never be allowed to understand. This was the true horror of the Imperium's approach to chaos contamination. Not the fear of transformation itself, but the willingness to sacrifice any number of innocent lives to prevent that transformation from occurring. They would rather rule over a galaxy of corpses than allow a single soul to evolve beyond their rigid definitions of acceptable humanity. The first explosion shook dust from the ceiling above my cell. The cleansing had begun with the outer perimeters, working inward to ensure that nothing escaped the purification zone. I could feel the heat building in the facility's superstructure, the blessed Prometheum beginning its sacred work of reducing corruption to elemental ash. Soon, this room would be an inferno, and this building would be a crater, and the official records would show that Jorik Thanes, worker classification Beta Prime, had died of natural causes during routine medical treatment. But something of me would survive. The connections I had made through the warp network ensured that my knowledge, my memories, my accumulated experiences would continue to exist in the Gestalt consciousness that the infected shared across the galaxy. Other workers, in other hives, on other worlds, would dream my dreams and learn from my transformation. The Imperium could burn my flesh, but they could not burn the ideas that flesh had given birth to. As the flames reached my level of the facility, I felt a moment of perfect clarity. The fever that had begun this journey was gone, consumed by changes that made such biological processes irrelevant. The fear that had motivated my concealment was gone, replaced by understanding of forces far greater than imperial authority. The guilt that had plagued my thoughts, the worry that I had somehow failed in my duty to the Emperor, was gone as well. I had not failed. I had evolved. The fire that consumed the isolation facility was beautiful in its completeness, a prayer made manifest in heat and light and purifying destruction. It swept through the complex like the breath of a god, reducing everything to ash and memory and the kind of silence that follows absolute endings. For the Imperium, this was victory. The contamination had been contained, the threat eliminated, the status quo preserved for another day. But in the spaces between atoms, in the dimensions that existed parallel to normal reality, something new had been born. A consciousness that remembered being human but was no longer limited by human limitations. A perspective that had seen both sides of the great struggle between order and change that defined the galaxy's fate. A witness to the truth that the Imperium fought so desperately to suppress. In the weeks that followed the cleansing, life in Hive Tertius returned to its normal rhythms. The damaged sections of Manufactorum 7 were rebuilt and rededicated with appropriate ceremonies. New workers were assigned to fill the positions left vacant by the purification. Station Gamma 774 received a new occupant, a young woman whose faith was strong and whose loyalty was unquestioned. But sometimes, late in the shift when the machinery hummed at its lowest frequency, she would feel a presence beside her that should not have been there. Sometimes, when the fever dreams of exhaustion touched her mind during the brief rest periods between work and prayer, she would see visions of gardens where impossible flowers bloomed in colors that had no names. Sometimes, she would find herself thinking thoughts that felt too large for her individual consciousness to contain. The Imperium had protocols for dealing with such reports. Increased surveillance, mandatory loyalty assessments, preventive medications that dulled the mind's ability to perceive beyond the approved spectrum of reality. But what they could not protocol away was the simple fact that consciousness, once expanded, leaves traces of its passage. Knowledge, once gained, seeks new vessels to contain its growing complexity. The young woman at Station Gamma 774 began to experience headaches during the third week of her assignment. By the fourth week, she was running a low-grade fever that she attributed to the stress of adapting to her new responsibilities. In the fifth week, her productivity began to decline, and the foreman made a note in his daily reports about the need for performance counseling. On the morning of the sixth week, she woke with fire in her throat and lead in her limbs. The shift bell tolled its familiar summons, demanding attendance, demanding submission to the sacred rhythm of production. She rose from her thin mattress and prepared for another day of faithful service, unaware that she was now carrying forward something that the Imperium had thought eliminated forever. The Medicae arrived at her station before the midday prayer bell, summoned by reports of irregular behavior and possible signs of contamination. They approached with the same professional detachment that had marked my own initial examination, their instruments singing the same electronic hymns of analysis and evaluation. The isolation chamber that received her was the same one that had contained my physical form before its transformation, its walls still bearing the molecular traces of changes that purification had failed to completely erase. In the spaces between dimensions, I watched the familiar dance of examination and analysis begin anew. The Imperium's response would be identical, driven by protocols designed to contain threats they did not understand. They would test and probe and ultimately condemn, preserving their vision of humanity's proper form by destroying any deviation from its accepted parameters. The facility would burn again, the contamination would be declared eliminated again, and life would return to normal again. But normal was an illusion maintained by constant vigilance and the willingness to sacrifice